So a few years ago, I heard a story about a lady who had been in a concentration camp in the Second World War. She was not Jewish, but her family hid some Jewish people in their home, and the Gestapo in the Netherlands heard about this, and they were arrested, and they were sent to Treblinka, the concentration camp. And their mother had passed away before the Second World War, so it was just her dad and her and her sister. And all three of them were arrested and shipped off to Treblinka. And while they were there, of course, they were treated absolutely terribly. And her sister and her father both died, actually, under the terrible conditions in that concentration camp. But this young lady survived, and she actually really kind of found her faith during her time in the concentration camp. After the Second World War, she actually wrote about it, and then she started to travel and speak. And at one of the services where she was speaking, at the end, she'd been talking about forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness. And of course, that was a very important thing, especially for those that were involved in the Second World War, to be able to move on with their lives. And at the end of the service, she invited people to come and pray for God to help them forgive. And lo and behold, as she's inviting people to come forward to pray, a man stands up at the back of the sanctuary and starts coming down the center aisle. And as she looks up into his face, she recognizes him. He was the German overseer of Treblinka. He was responsible for the death of her sister and her dad. And in that moment, her blood turned ice and she just froze. And he didn't recognize her, but he came up to the front, and he came up and he reached out his hand to shake her hand and to thank her for her message. And she had to make a decision in that moment. Was she going to forgive, or was she going to be a hypocrite? And she remembered, as she told this story afterwards, the wrestling inside of her in that moment. And she prayed under her breath for God to help her. And she felt like deep within her, God gave her the strength to be able to reach out her hand and shake this man's hand, and to say to him, I can't remember the exact words, and of course they were not in English, but basically, God bless you. I don't know how I would have reacted in a situation like that. When we go all in with Jesus, it affects our relationships with other people. She had committed herself to going all in with Jesus, and so she felt that calling in that moment to forgive like Jesus forgives. So the question I want to wrestle with this morning is, how do you respond to people who wrong you? Do you unfollow them online? Do you avoid them? It's kind of hard if they live in Whitecourt to avoid people. I don't know, have you ever driven into the Canadian Tire parking lot and seen somebody's car there and decided, oh, I will come back later? So I want to talk about some real nuts and bolts kinds of situations today. And I love how practical the Bible is. Jesus was really the kind of person that talked about stuff where the rubber really hits the road. And that's what I want to do this morning. So I want to go to the first book of the New Testament. So the New Testament is the second one, or the last 1/3 of the Bible. And Matthew is the very first book in the New Testament. I want to go to chapter 18, and starting in verse 15. Now, just if you want to turn there, either on your phone or on your in your Bible, I'd recommend that. But I want you to pay attention here to how practical Jesus is. He's speaking, and he says, "If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you've won that person back. But if you're unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. Then, if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. I also tell you this, if 2 of you agree here on earth concerning anything you ask, my Father in heaven will do it for you. For where 2 or 3 gather together as my followers, I am there among them." Then Peter came to him and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times?" "No, not 7 times," Jesus replied, "but 70 times 7. That's like 490 times. Basically, Jesus is saying there's no limit to forgiveness. So the basic message here in this teaching that Jesus is giving is don't give up on people too quickly. Our culture is moving in a very sad direction right now, in my opinion. People are becoming increasingly replaceable in each other's lives. We have this thing called cancel culture. So I read some research recently that I found really fascinating. Online dating has become a thing in the last 10 years or more. And probably most of us know people who have met their spouse through online dating. But one of the things that they were researching is how does online dating affect the longevity or the commitment level of partners to each other? And what they found is that actually people who meet online have a much lower level of commitment to their marriage than people who don't meet online. And as they kind of dug deeper into this, what they discovered is that when you go through the process of swiping either left or right, you subconsciously realize or sort of come to the realization that there's a lot of choice out there. And that subconsciously causes you to feel, as you meet somebody and commit to them in a stable long-term relationship, that subconsciously the feeling is, well, if this doesn't work out, there's a lot more people out there. And so there's this easy sense of replaceability that has taken hold even at that level. Cancel culture basically says, if you don't affirm everything that I believe, you are my enemy, or at the very least, you certainly don't love me. And so basically, we have this global community to choose from, so I can be picky. If you're not exactly the kind of person that I want, I don't need to have anything to do with you. I can just find somebody else who is much more like me. I don't think that's a very good way to live. I actually think that's a terrible way to live. And I think Jesus saw things the same. Jesus does not see people as replaceable. Jesus actually went out of his way to embrace people and to show them how much he valued them. Everywhere Jesus went, he actually reached out specifically to people that were being canceled or frowned upon by other people in that culture. Everywhere Jesus went, he was looking for those people who were falling through the cracks. Jesus actually went around uncanceling people. Our culture cancels people, but Jesus does the exact opposite. He uncancels them. So in this passage that we're looking at this morning, Jesus is actually showing us at a very practical level, if you're wanting to follow him in his footsteps, if you're wanting to go all in and be like Jesus, here's how to make sure that you don't fall into the cancel culture mindset. Here's how you become an uncanceller of people. Now, let's face it, everybody has people that hurt them. We all get offended. We all have people do things to us that are hurtful. We all have things happen to us that make us feel yuck. And here is what we need to do when we are tempted to cancel those people out of our lives. And we have a fancy word for this that sometimes gets very, very badly abused. We call it setting boundaries. And setting boundaries can be very healthy if you do it in the right way. But I fear that many people that set boundaries are actually just using that phrase to cancel people out of their lives. So what is Jesus saying here? He's saying, never walk away from another person that has hurt you without having a quality conversation about how they hurt you first. So Jesus is calling us to face the people that are hurting us face to face, letting them know exactly what went wrong. Now that's a very scary thing to do. I hate confrontation. I am probably one of the worst people as far as being able to face those people head on, but that's exactly what Jesus calls us to. And one of the things that helps me in this is that I realize that it's not really fair to walk away from somebody without telling them why, without giving them a chance to change, without giving them a fair opportunity to understand what's really happening in our relationship. To just walk away without giving them a chance to explain themselves or to understand our own heart in what's going on is really not fair. It's not a loving thing to do. And we can justify it saying, oh yeah, but I need to protect my heart and all of that. But Jesus calls us not to just think about our own heart, but to think about their heart as well. Now here's just some of my advice that I've picked up along the way. This isn't something that's from the Bible, but when you have that quality conversation with somebody that has hurt you, the first 90 seconds are absolutely critical. And there's two things you want to do in those first 90 seconds of that conversation that are very, very important, and they sort of balance each other out. So here's the first one. Conversations tend to start or tend to end the way they start. So if you start the conversation harshly, it will often end harshly. But if you start the conversation softly, it will often end softly. So in that first 90 seconds, the thing you want to do is start softly. Start with the remembering that what you ultimately want here is reconciliation. You want to make your relationship whole again. You want to heal it. So that's your goal. So you want to make sure that you start with that goal in mind. Now, the balancing side of that is you also want to make sure in that first 90 seconds of the conversation that you say everything you need to say. So don't dance around the issues. Because ultimately, if you dance around the issues in the first 90 seconds, people will sometimes feel duped when you finally get to the real meat of why you wanted to talk to them. So you want to make sure that you're starting softly on the one hand, but also being very honest right from the get-go. Now, if your first conversation with them does not go well, don't give up. Never give up if it's just one conversation. Bring another person into the process. Someone you both trust. Jesus is saying, don't just walk away after you've sort of done your best. Get other people involved as well. And the truth is, most of us need several explanations before we get it in almost every situation. And so Jesus is saying, give the person a second chance. Bring somebody else in that maybe will be able to explain it in different words, or help kind of be a bridge between the two of you. Help the two of you to kind of find a way to understand each other. Now, here, I just want to give some advice to all of us here that might be a little bit uncomfortable for us as Canadians. You know, as Canadians, we like to have our bubble, and we don't like to mess in other people's business. And if somebody comes and asks you if you would be willing to go with them to have one of these difficult conversations, as Canadians, our natural inclination is, oh, no, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to, I don't want to get into anything that's none of my business. But I think if we are actually going to be a church the way Jesus designed us to be a church, we actually should be saying yes to those requests. As uncomfortable as they are to us as Canadians, we need to be there for each other, even in those difficult conversations. As a matter of fact, that can be some of the most bonding things that can happen to us as fellow sojourners on this journey with Jesus. So if somebody comes and asks you, would you go with me and help me to try to reconcile with another person, don't say no. At the very least, pray sincerely about it. And you might feel like you're not qualified, like you've got all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't. But please Don't just say no because it's uncomfortable. Now, it's very, very important to understand when this happens, you're not ganging up on the person. This is all with the goal of restoring the relationship. You're always trying to bring health to the situation. You're not doing this to try to pound that person into submission or into understanding or anything like that. You're there to try to build bridges. Now, if that doesn't work, Jesus says, bring it to the church. Now, I'm not totally sure exactly how that's supposed to work, to be honest with you. I have never really seen this practiced in churches, but I think the main point here is that Jesus is saying, whatever you do, don't give up too quickly. Now, the Jews, and Matthew was a Jew, they would bring their disagreements to the priests. And the priests would help them kind of figure out how to work through stuff. And Jesus may have envisioned something similar to that. He may have envisioned that we as a church would kind of help process this with people. The main point, again, is that don't give up too quickly. Now, after you've tried everything you can think of to try to work through situations, to try to reconcile, that's when it's appropriate to start setting boundaries. That's when it's appropriate to say, okay, I maybe need to have a bit of distance here between you and I, so that you don't keep hurting me. But I think, unfortunately, in our culture, we jump way too quickly to that point, rather than working through this process that Jesus put out here for us. And it's interesting that Jesus says that you can treat people at that point like a heathen and a tax collector. So those were people that the Jews really despised. Now, Jesus didn't, however. Jesus loved them. And Matthew, actually, who wrote this, was a former tax collector. So I don't think Jesus is saying here you can basically snub people once, you've worked through the process. I think what he's actually saying here is that you can love them from a distance if you have to. And then Jesus goes on from there and talks to Peter about how important it is to forgive. So even when people are miserable to you and you can't work out your relationship, Jesus still calls us to forgive. He doesn't call us to be unwise in the way that we relate to them, but he does call us to forgive. You see, forgiveness is not something we do for the benefit of the other person. Forgiveness is something we do for the benefit of ourselves. The most important thing when you're having conflict with another person is to keep a soft heart yourself. And sometimes that's the most difficult thing. But yet that is exactly what Jesus calls us to. We have this little saying around here, we don't get worked up, we work it out around here. We work it out. So what is the most important factor in working towards reconciliation? Jesus was an expert at this. And the most important factor when you are trying to work through a situation with somebody is actually listening. How many of you had a mother or maybe a dad who said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth? Anybody? Yeah, a few of you. And there's a reason for that. we need to listen twice as much as we speak. And this is one of the most powerful ways that you can show you love people, is through listening to them. I call it love listening. Now, all of the stuff that I've just said, if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, this is all optional for you. But if you are a follower of Jesus, you are called to be like Jesus. And this is what Jesus taught us to do. So it's not just something you can go, well, oh yeah, whatever. No, if you're all in with Jesus, this is what it looks like at a very practical, rubber hits the road level. Now, what I'm going to say now, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, this is good advice for everyone. Jesus calls us to love people with no strings attached, to just listen to their perspective, not because of what they can do for you, not because if you listen to them, they will listen to you. He calls us just to listen so we can understand. He calls us to listen just so that I can express to you that I really, really care about you as a person. So the question becomes, how do you know if you are really listening to another person? Well, there's a few different ways you know if you're really listening to the other person. One is, if you can explain their perspective just as well as they can, then you know you're listening. Another one that can be an indicator of whether you're really listening or not is, what are the first words out of your mouth once they have stopped talking? If the first words out of your mouth are, well, I think, you're not really listening. You've just been listening so that you could respond, not listening so you would understand. If the first words out of your mouth are you saying, da-da-da-da-da, now you're actually listening to them. You're trying to make sure that you actually understand what they're saying. So you might want to think about that when you're in a conversation with another person, especially one of these tense conversations. If you hear yourself saying, but I think, you're not really listening. But if you hear yourself saying, let me just get this straight. Is this what you're saying? Now you're on the right track. Stephen Covey says, seek to understand before seeking to be understood. I fear that far too often I have done the reverse. Seek to be understood first. And that doesn't work well. Now here's the thing, it takes a very secure person to listen. You really need to know who you are and what you believe yourself. Because if you're listening carefully to another person, but you're insecure in yourself, you can feel like you're losing yourself. You're losing your ability to think for yourself. You're losing your right to have your own opinion. And that can be very, very scary. Now, most people who are healthy will be willing to listen to you if you really listen to them. And if they're not willing to listen to you once you have genuinely listened to them, now you know there's a much bigger problem. You're dealing with a very unhealthy person. And you probably will need some outside help. But the key thing here is for you need to have Jesus as the anchor for your soul in that moment. Your identity needs to be rooted in Jesus in order to be able to have the inner security to be able to genuinely listen to another person, especially if they have hurt you. I remember hearing this story about two siblings, two brothers actually, and they were adults at this point, and they were visiting each other, and one of them had a good relationship with their dad, and the other one did not. And they got talking about their dad, and the one who didn't have a relationship with their dad, he remembered a certain situation that had happened when they were both kids. And he brought it up to his brother. And he said, remember that time when you were unloading the vegetables into the fridge and you dropped them on the floor and Dad blew up at you and disciplined you for that? He said, I've never been able to forgive Dad for that. That was just so unfair. You just had a simple accident and Dad just blows a gasket. And his brother said, oh no, that's not what happened. You couldn't see from where you were, but Dad could see from where he was. I actually dumped the vegetables on the floor on purpose because I was trying to spite Dad. And he was totally correct in disciplining me in that moment for what I did. But from where you were standing, you couldn't see that. And here, all these years, this other brother had been holding a grudge against his dad for something that was perfectly legitimate, but because he never listened, never asked the question, what really happened, he never knew. And he lived in a deception and took it out on his dad all of those years. So my question to all of us this morning is, are you secure enough to just listen? Do you love enough to just listen? Are you like Jesus enough to just listen? With your kids, with your parents, with your spouse, with your friends. Now maybe you're kind of sitting here today going, well, I'm not even sure if I am a follower of Jesus, let alone going all in with Jesus. But maybe this has challenged you and you're going, this Jesus guy sounds like he would be good for me. And if you would like to have a relationship with Jesus and like to invite him into your life, you can do that right here, right today. I'm going to pray in a minute, and I invite you to just open your heart to Jesus as I do that. But for all of us that are followers of Jesus, I think Jesus is challenging us today to up our level of commitment to him by upping our commitment to listening to the people in our lives that we have a difficult time with. There's this saying, skeletons in the closet. You don't have to put up your hand if you have skeletons in your closet. But I think Jesus might actually be calling us to clean out our closets every so often. If you go all in with Jesus, he calls us to have clean closets. No skeletons. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, we thank you that you are so practical. Even though I hate it, quite honestly, I know it's good for me. And so, Jesus, I pray that you would help me to clean out my closet. Help all of us here today to clean out all the skeletons in our closet. Help all of us, Lord, to be true listeners, people who seek to understand more than seeking to be understood. Jesus, I pray that you would help all of us not to just talk the talk of being a Jesus follower, but actually to walk the walk, to do what you do and did. Help each one of us, Jesus, to have the inner security in you to be a listener just like you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.